Hello, good day everyone. Today is Wednesday and it's a repeat of yesterday, because yesterday was the start of the last week of 9.1 for NA servers and today is the start of the last week of 9.1 for EU servers. So yesterday we went over what will change in 9.1.5 with a particular focus on Mythic Plus. We took a time capsule of the state of Mythic Plus at the last week of this patch and then tried to take a look at what could change in the future given the two most important changes coming in the patch when it comes to this type of activity, which is one, the AOE target cap being lifted for several specs and their abilities, and number two, the ability to freely respec between covenants. So now that we're gonna go and take a closer look with another time capsule for raid encounters, it's gonna be about the same thing, but of course the priorities are a little bit different. The fact that the AOE target caps is going to be lifted for some abilities is going to have a much higher impact on Mythic Plus. You're going to have way more windows, way more rooms of opportunity to mow down dozens of mobs in a Mythic Plus encounter compared to a raid boss. So the whole change about the target caps is not as relevant in raid encounters. Not often do you have situations where you will be hitting more than 5 targets in the raid. It's not as relevant compared to what you can do with your AOE in Mythic Plus. Conversely, though, it's the same for Covenant respecs, because if AOE caps is more relevant to Mythic Plus, then Covenant respecs is more relevant for raid encounters. Number one, there is a pretty nice distinction to make, which is the fact that different bosses are not part of the same encounter. You can respec between bosses. Yes, I'm pretty sure several raid leaders next week are going to get triggered beyond belief because there's going to be a list of people wanting to respec literally every boss, but that's something you can do, which you can't in Mythic Plus. Secondly, the other thing that is worth mentioning is that Mythic Plus has a much more strict level, let's just say, of popularity and viability of specs compared to raid encounters. What I mean by that is usually, when you figure out that one spec is the strongest one, that's the only one you will play for every single Mythic Plus key. It's not really gonna matter if it's tyrannical or if it's fortified, if it's bursting or if it's quaking. Generally, if you figure out that Outlaw Rogue is the strongest rogue, or Frost Mage is the strongest mage, or Affliction Warlock is the strongest warlock, then you're gonna just keep playing that spec over every single key most of the time. Whereas, on the other hand, in raid encounters, it's much more versatile and fluid, because sometimes you might be wanting pure single target, sometimes you might want burst, sometimes you might want cleave, AoE, etc, which makes it much more easy for you to be able to respec to different specs and different covenants to better match the encounter. So the fact that 9.1.5 gives you this opportunity makes it more relevant and valuable for raids, for specs in the raid. So we are going to go and take a look at the current situation of the raid right before we hit 9.1.5, just so in a few weeks we can go and compare how things have been moving, how things have been shaking up given these additions in this upcoming patch. So the first thing we're going to stick into our capsule, as you know by this point, is the popularity. That's always the greatest sign to see how the community is moving around the changes in the game. So we can look at the popularity right now, and we can also comment on what we went over in all the previous weeks, where we went and looked at popularity of raid encounters, which is the fact that Beast Mastery has kept growing at a blistering pace. Man, it felt just like yesterday when we were talking about Beast Mastery passing marksmanship, but now nearly doubling marksmanship's popularity in mythic bosses. The same goes for Fire Mage. It also felt like yesterday when we were talking about just passing Frost. Now it's in the top 5 of most played mythic raiding specs. Same goes for Demonology, which is about to. Not quite. I could have just waited a few more hours probably after this Wednesday's reclear in EU to get Demonology to pass Destruction, but right now not quite. But this is the current situation as far as popularity is concerned when it comes to Mythic. We can, sure, we can also stop for a minute and look at the comparison with Heroic. So, as usual, once we lower the barrier of entry, the floodgates open for Beast Mastery, which gets to an absurd number compared to all of the other specs. The other specs have remained mostly the same, like Havoc, like Harms, like Balance, Marksmanship are still close to the top. The only main difference is, as expected, Fire. Fire Mage seems to have been the pick of more high-end players in Mythic progression, whereas the more broad side of the Mage player base is still preferring Frost over Fire Mage. The situation doesn't change too much either for healers. This has been a much more stable situation for months now, where Holy Paladin and Restoration Shaman are dominating over the other specs. At this point, they have actually doubled the representation of any other healer when it comes to Mythic. They have not doubled, however, when it comes to Heroic. As usual, we have pointed this out before, Restoration Druid remains super popular amongst the majority of the player base when you go below Mythic, and same goes for Holy Priest, which is always the destination of choice of all of the tanks' girlfriends that play this game. Whereas Discipline in Heroic, you know, it's the more complex and also the more difficult to play out spec, which makes it even harder to pull it off in Heroic, because many of these Heroic logs are going to be pugs and similar, where Discipline doesn't have as good of a time to perform. Lastly, we have the tank situation when it comes to popularity, which has continued on the same note for a few weeks now, which is Blood and Brewmaster have settled for being the most popular specs in Mythic raiding, with the slow but steady decline of Vengeance as Havoc continues to grow, as well as the comparison with the Heroic situation, where we point out, as usual, Prot Paladin, for reasons unknown, remains a super popular tank amongst the broader part of the player base. Now, before we go over the bigger and broader subject of the video, which is of course going to be the DPS changes and what could impact them, we can stop for tanks and healers first, because they also have, perhaps unfortunately, if you are interested in the roles, the least amount of changes. First of all, as mentioned, the AOE cap being changed and removed for many specs is not really going to impact tanks too much, and healers pretty much at all, so it's not that relevant. What is left then to be relevant is the Covenant. How many of these healers or tanks could be able to have a resurgence in the raid because they are now allowed to play multiple Covenants? Were perhaps some healers not considered as good in raid encounters because they were using their best Mythic Plus Covenant, which was hurting them in raids, and now they will be able to just spike up in performance, or maybe not? So when it comes to healers, Discipline Priest is more likely to just remain Kyrian. You have Holy Paladin, which is almost certain to remain Venthyr. Then you have Restoration Druid, which is very likely to remain Night Fae. You do have three specs that might change around, might try things out, like Mistweaver, Holy Priest, and Restoration Shaman. Because Mistweaver was almost predominantly Venthyr in raid encounters, but in Mythic Plus they were also playing Kyrian. Again, it might be one of the cases where it's Brewmaster monks or Windwalker monks respecking or just playing out some Mythic Plus as Mistweaver, and they basically cannot change their covenant, so it's gonna show up as a different covenant than the preferred one of Mistweaver, which is Venthyr. The same could be said for Holy Priest. So Holy Priest has been actually hopping on and off. They have been Kyrian, they have been Night Fae. Back when Discipline was playing Venthyr, many Holy Priests were also Venthyr, as well as Necrolord being a decent choice. So Holy Priest is going to have one of the larger opportunities of jumping around and trying all of the different covenants and finding them good. So that's a pick. The other pick is Resto Shaman that we went over already. Resto Shaman is primarily Necrolord in raid encounters, but then in Mythic Plus they can go and move over to Kyrian, so that's going to be one of the main changes. It's not going to impact raid as much, because most of the shamans playing the raid were already Necrolord. This is likely going to impact Mythic Plus shamans a little bit more, as we went over already. The other side of the non-DPS is going to be tanks. So tanks do have a few changes here. We have touched yesterday on the bigger one, which was going to be Prot Paladin. Prot Paladin has a significant chasm between raids and Mythic Plus. Raid encounters do want a Prot Paladin to bring Ashen Hallow, just because it brings more damage, in case a burst window of a boss is needed, and also more healing. So that's what they want to be in the raid. However, in Mythic Plus, Ashen Hallow for a Prot Paladin is not quite as big as something like Incarnation for a Guardian Druid. It's not as gigantic as an Immortal cooldown as that, so it's not really that necessary. On the other hand, Divine Toll is much better for a Prot Paladin, so they will be the biggest and strongest beneficiaries of being able to change Covenants for tanks. Demon Hunter is not really gonna change too much because Vengeance is playing Kyrian and is gonna stay Kyrian. Same goes for Prot Warrior. Most of Prot Warriors by now have gone Kyrian. Perhaps some of them will try to go back to Night Fae, try it out a little bit, but the majority of them will likely stay Kyrian. Same goes for Guardian Druid, where most of them will remain Night Fae. The only other slight change is Blood Decay. Blood Decay did want to sort of change around between the raid encounter while they stayed Necrolord. It was also very good to have Abomination Limb on fights like Soul Render, for example, for the ad gripping, but in Mythic Plus you still had Swarming Mist. You still had the Ventir Covenant ability, which was very good for the AOE packs and the pulling of Mythic Plus trash. So most Blood DKs were going Ventir. So this is going to allow all of the other DKs playing tanks in raid encounters staying Necrolord to move over to Ventir whenever they want to Mythic Plus, or all of the Blood DKs playing Mythic Plus exclusively or primarily who are already Ventir, they will be able to go over to Necrolord to play raid encounters. However, the effectiveness, the buff of a DK going Necrolord in raids is not nearly as impactful as a Prot Paladin becoming Ventir for the raid. It's not going to be as big of a change for tanks. Now, getting over with the non-DPS specs and classes, we can move over to the actual DPS specs and classes. So first of all, we have to look the last time we take a glance at this DPS chart for 9.1. It is, as always, very impressive. I will remember every one of this again. The fact that this is the highest we have ever seen a single class be simultaneously, because we currently have 3 rogue specs in the top 4 of better performing specs overall in the raid, which is a unique thing. You have never seen all 3 mage specs be at this level simultaneously. You've never seen all 3 warlock specs like this simultaneously. You have never even seen classes with just a couple of specs like warriors, or both ranged hunters, or maybe both druid specs or both shaman specs. They have never even been remotely close to this level, and this time we have gotten rogues. So that's the most striking thing out of the last time we look at this damage profile. Now, aside from this, we can now apply the situation of all of these specs to how much they can gain from the changes of 9.1.5. As mentioned, the AOE cap in raid encounters is not going to affect too much of anything. The more important one is the Covenant change. So, number one, the Covenant change is not exactly going to buff any of these specs. It's more likely going to buff the class as a whole. For example, perhaps right now Outlaw could perform much better. Why? Because there are going to be some sub-rogues as Ventir, some assassination rogues as Ventir who tried out Outlaw, but they tried it out as Ventir because they couldn't go Necrolord, which is the covenant of choice of Outlaw. So in 9.1.5, every rogue who wants to try Outlaw will have the opportunity to spec in the best possible covenant for Outlaw, just like Frost mages being Ventir trying out Arcane while still being Ventir, or perhaps Kyrian Arcane mages trying out Frost while still being Kyrian. This was something that limited the best possible results, the best possible performance of all of the specs in 9.1, and it will change in 9.1.5. That is what this change can bring to the specs. What improvement, what buff I was talking about in the last video can happen through these specs, and also why I said is more relevant to raid encounters than it is to Mythic Plus. Because raid encounters have multiple bosses, are going to have different types of damage profiles, which is something you can change by changing your spec, or in some cases by changing your covenant. And as far as covenants are concerned, we do have some changes, because first of all, you have warriors. It's a pretty interesting start because when it comes to arms and fury, they are both playing different setups, because the setup of Mythic Plus that they would want is to play Kyrian. The Spear of Bastion is very good in Mythic Plus, not just the damage, but the utility of the spear itself is also very good. Not to mention, Mechanicus is busted when it comes to AoE and when it comes to CDR, cooldown reduction of your big Covenant ability to use over and over in Mythic Plus trash. So it's very good, but in raid encounters not as much, which is why more Arms Warriors are moving over to Night Fae when it comes to raids, and now they will be able to play both Covenants, depending on the activity. Same goes for Fury, which is predominantly Kyrian in Mythic Plus, but Venthyr in raid encounters. So this is a first example of this patch bringing a buff to the class as a whole. Previously, if you were a warrior, you had to choose if you want to play Arms or Fury, and then you had to choose which of the Covenants you wanted to play, and then which of the Covenant was also going to have a different impact whether or not you wanted to focus on Mythic Plus or whether or not you wanted to focus on raid encounters. This is going to be lifted in 9.1.5, and considering it was a pretty decent, heavy burden for warrior specs, it's a pretty good buff. Now you can play Arms as a Kyrian in Mythic Plus, then you can respec for Raid Knight to try out Fury, and you can go over to Venthyr, but then you can swap out mid-progress, mid-farm to go over to Arms, this time as Night Fae for a different boss. Sure, your raid leader will hate you, but that is something you can do. A more important class worth talking about is Rogue, because Rogue, as we talked about, was in the top of the best performers overall in the raid, and 3 of them are Rogues, so what if this patch buffs them even more? It does give them a little bit more leeway, because Subtlety is playing Venthyr in pretty much all the situations. Outlaw is also predominantly as Necrolord, whereas Assassination is sort of in the middle. Still, primarily Venthyr. So this patch is basically going to allow you to just keep the best Covenant for the 3 different specs you wanted to play. Many of the other specs won't really have this type of freedom. Both of the DK specs, for example, are predominantly Necrolord, regardless of the encounter, so regardless of the activity. Windwalker is also predominantly Necrolord as well. You also have Retribution Paladin, which is just permanently Kyrian. However, they might have the chance in raid encounters, particularly when more burst is needed, to go over to Venthyr now. That's a good change for Paladins. Demon Hunters are all predominantly Night Fae, and it's unlikely to change. Ferals are absolutely 100% gonna stay Night Fae as well. The only other spec that has a little bit more of a chance of moving around is Enhancement, which was initially Venthyr and then moved over a little bit more to Night Fae for raid encounters, and now they will be able to do both at the same time. So, as far as melee DPS are concerned, the bigger changes are going to be for warrior specs, a little bit also for rogue specs, as well as for enhancement shamans. And just so I don't get a fine, survival is also in the same boat. Survival is Kyrian and is also likely going to just stay Kyrian, even if they have the opportunity to move around their Covenant. The situation is a little bit more dire, however, for ranged DPS, because at the moment it's going to look unlikely that Affliction, Beast Mastery, Demonology, Destruction, Fire Mage and Marksmanship Hunter are going to move away from Night Fae. I am sure they will, because they have the opportunity to try, so trying things out is always cool. So there is no doubt people are going to try some meme shit with different Covenants, but it's unlikely that they're going to move away from Night Fae on a permanent basis if they are doing Mythic Plus rather than raiding, or a certain boss rather than another. So it's a little bit more stationary and stale than the melee side of things. The same can also be said for Arcane, which is going to stay Kyrian, Balanced Druid as Venthyr, as well as Shadow Priest as Necrolord. The only change, almost certain, is for Elemental Shaman, which is going to stay Night Fae because of the benefit you can gain in Mythic Plus, but not as much in raids, where they can go over to Necrolord and have a better result. There are some situations where you're going to be led by the Sims to try out a different build. For example, Arcane Mages theoretically on paper could seem higher as Venthyr, so maybe some Arcane Mages are going to try out Venthyr. The same goes for Frost. Frost is primarily Venthyr overall, but in Mythic Plus they could go over to Night Fae as well. So you do have some windows of opportunity to try out some things, to experiment, to freshen up your experience in the game by trying something new, which is always one of the bigger ways for you to get to enjoy the game when you explore something different and new. But ultimately, when it comes to the final decision, let's just say you are preparing your choice for 9.2, for example, ultimately range DPS seem to be more stuck and more fixed on certain picks compared to the melee DPS. Not too much to touch on about when it comes to the AOE cap lifting, as mentioned, because, you know, red encounters are not going to have that much of an impact when it comes to that type of change. So for now, these were the changes that we will save in our collective minds or in my channel when it comes to the situation in the meta for the Sanctum of Domination raid, right before some significant changes are going to come right over us in the next patch. We will eventually see what is going to happen after a few weeks, that all of these classes and specs are going to try all these different Covenant combinations. Eventually, we will see what emerges from the fog. Once the smoke clears, we will be able to see which of these new combinations have been created, if there are any to be seen, and we will be able to compare it to what we have just gone over in this video to see the differences. So for now, we can stop here. As usual, as is routine, thank you for watching the video. If you have enjoyed the content and want to keep supporting the channel, you can leave a like on the video, comment as well down below, particularly about which are your specific picks you have been thinking about playing. If you already know, no matter what people tell you, that you want to try Night Fae Arcane Mage, or if you want to try Necrolord Arms Warrior and you will try it no matter what, let me guys know. And also, as usual, only if you have cleaned your room in the last week, you can subscribe to the channel as well. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I have to go and choose my dinner for tonight. The choice are between carbonara or pilaf rice with chicken curry. It's a tough choice, I know.